The title of this lecture is So What is Environmental Science? And just as the title indicates, we're going to learn about the definitions and misconceptions that people have about environmental science. Before we begin, though, let's talk a little bit about a brief history of the environmental science movement. The roots of the environmental science movement are traced back to the 1800s. In the early 1800s, different legislators in the United States started to protect large parcels of land for conservation purposes, and this was really unheard of up until that point in history. In the late 1800s, John Muir founded the famous Sierra Club, which is one of the largest conservation organizations in the United States today. Another person, George Perkins Marsh, was influential in regards to the need for resource conservation. He was a U.S. representative as well as a lawyer in the late 1800s as well. The birth of the environmental movement is thought to have started in the 1950s. Over the course of several decades, starting in the 1950s, there were many influential events that caused dramatic environmental damage and damage to humans. In the 1960s, a book was published called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, and it drew attention to the impact of chemicals on the natural environment. For example, research was showing that spraying the chemical called DDT to kill mosquitoes was killing off birds and poisoning people. In the 1970s, this DDT chemical actually was banned because it was proven to be a carcinogen, and really this is what we think kicked off the environmental movement in the United States. In the late 1960s, an oil tanker went aground off the coast of England, causing the world's first major oil spill. And this large oil spill was the biggest one in history at that time. And this prompted some of the first legislation governing oil tankers and the need for important environmental regulations. In the early 1970s, there was a big lawsuit in Japan that drew attention to the effects of mercury poisoning on some people that were living near to certain factories. So many different events came to light, and they really taught us the importance of regulating and protecting our environment. So on our screen here, it shows us some of the forms that the environmental movement has taken today. Things such as recycling and composting, styrofoam or plastic bag bans, reusable food containers, reusable cups, native plant gardens in urban areas, and solar energy. These are the things that many people think about when they think about the environmental movement. Our perceptions of environmental science are shaped by many parts of society. This includes things such as our beliefs from growing up, our education, or even the media around us. Now, there are some beliefs that some people may have, and even if you don't agree with these ideas, thinking about them can be a very useful learning process. Here are some of the statements or notions we could make about environmental science, and we're going to look at these one by one. The first is, biology and environmental science are pretty much the same discipline. In reality, environmental science is actually an interdisciplinary academic field that integrates physical and biological studies into the study of our environment and solutions of environmental problems. Environmental science provides an integrated and quantitative approach to the study of environmental systems. Our next notion is that environmental science mostly aims to save animals. Now, environmental science is much more than just about animals. It's not just about hippies saving whales or pandas. I would argue that the conservation of these animals is still very important, but there is so much more that we will learn about environmental science over the course of this semester. Our next notion is that helping the environment doesn't help me. Think about it. Why is it that we say we need to save the environment? Is it to sustain ourselves? Is it to sustain our lifestyles? Or is it to sustain the world around us? We could say that there is an anthropocentric versus nature-centric view of the world. And this is that interplay between people and the environment. Another notion is that you must have a lot of money to be environmentally friendly. For this one, we want to consider environmental, economic, and social trade-offs. Consider if there actually needs to be a trade-off between economic growth and environmental health. How can these trade-offs be balanced as to achieve sustainable development? Our next notion is that activism is the only career choice for someone interested in environmental science. I would say that there are lots of career paths in environmental science, and one website, www.ecojobs.com, is a great place to look. Engineering, renewable energy, conservation and protection, outdoor education, and environmental policy and environmental law are just a few of those careers. Another notion is that environmental problems affect everyone equally. And this one is something we're going to explore a lot over the course of the semester. Often people think to themselves, well, it's one planet, so we're all affected the same. But I would argue that it's not necessarily that easy. Now we will talk about environmental justice. And I would ask you to think to yourself, what does environmental justice mean to you? The title of this report is Still Toxic After All These Years: Air Quality and Environmental Justice in the San Francisco Bay Area. This report was put together by the Environmental Health Collaborative with the help from UC Santa Cruz. And this report indicates lots of interesting trends in which people in the Bay Area are disproportionately affected by environmental damage. Before we go on, I would like you to consider these thought questions. How would you yourself define environmental justice? And what factors would potentially explain the locations of these environmental hazards or environmental emissions that affect human populations? So here is a figure from the report, and it shows the locations of facilities with air releases that are toxic. And these toxic air releases are relative to neighborhood demographics in the 9-county Bay Area. And we can see that in certain places of the Bay Area, there is much more toxic air. And then when we map demographics on these counties, we can see that in those places where there is the highest levels of pollution, there is also the highest numbers of percent people of color. So that shows us that these different populations of humans that are non-white live near these toxic areas. In this second figure, it shows us population by race and ethnicity and proximity to these toxic release facilities. And as we read these bar graphs, we can see that the farther you get away from a toxic waste facility, the higher the percentage of white families in proportion to families of color. So, based on this information, you can see that environmental justice really does play a role in that certain populations of people are living closer to these toxic areas. So the working definition for environmental justice in our course this semester is as follows: ensuring that all individuals, regardless of race, income, neighborhood, etc., have access to clean water, air, and other natural resources. Environmental justice can actually be separated from what we call environmental racism. Environmental racism is defined as waste sites and other hazardous facilities that tend to be in non-white neighborhoods. So your thought questions now that we've learned these definitions are this: why do you think it might be important for an environmental scientist working in the Bay Area to be aware of environmental justice issues? In this figure, it shows us that same map of the Bay Area, but now they map estimated cancer risk over these different populations. And it comes as no surprise to me, and hopefully not to you, that those neighborhoods that are near those toxic waste sites with a proportionally higher population of families of color also has a much higher lifetime cancer risk than other areas around that have a higher proportion of white families. So now we're going to move on and look at some key themes that are woven through environmental science. And some of these might seem obvious, but I still think they are worth mentioning, and they are very important to think about. Environmental science involves systems thinking. One move impacts everything else. Every decision you make as you move forward will have an impact on another part. If you only focus on the yellows of a Rubik's Cube forever, then you will overlook the other colors of that Rubik's Cube. We've got to think about the system as a whole in order to solve that puzzle. Next up is environmental unity. And we're going to think about different examples that illustrates this principle. Environmental unity means that it is impossible to change only one thing because everything affects everything else in a living system. First, let's think about an urban example. Many Midwestern U.S. cities, such as Chicago, had a shift in land use hundreds of years ago, where they moved from forest or agricultural lands to urban development. However, this construction increased the runoff and the soil erosion from all of the pavement and the buildings that were put in. And this, in turn, affects the rivers and can lead to flooding hazards. So as we are changing our land use in urban areas, it can start to lead to additional changes in the system. We can also think about environmental unity in a forest system. For example, as we are logging and doing other work in a forest, that can start to impact the animals that depend upon the different waterways, such as streams, found in these systems. Studying the relationships between the physical and biological systems are at the heart of environmental science. Environmental science is complicated. It often involves studying feedback loops. Now, a positive feedback loop is one that is pretty easy to visualize. For example, damp wood will burn hotter and hotter as time goes on because the water evaporates out, the wood gets less damp, and it starts to burn hotter. Another example of a positive feedback loop is the thawing of the polar ice caps. And as that polar ice cap melts, the carbon dioxide stored in the ice then goes into the atmosphere, where it contributes to global climate change, and then in some places the temperature heats up and then the ice melts, and you can see how this is a positive feedback loop. We also can find things such as negative feedback loops. For example, fighting hunger problems with more crops can be a solution, right? We need to feed our growing human population. However, producing more crops can lead to more fertilizers, which can lead to more chemicals being exposed to humans. And now humans could actually be getting sick from all of these chemicals, not to mention all of the fertilizers can lead to water contamination. So different feedback loops can be used to help us understand problems facing our environment. You might have heard the phrase, think global, act local. This is a commonly used phrase that was actually coined in the late 1960s by the environmental group called Friends of the Earth. It urges people to consider the health of the entire planet and to take action in their own communities and cities. Long before governments began enforcing environmental laws, individuals and families came together to protect habitats and the organisms that live within them. These efforts are often referred to as grassroots efforts. As you read the news or watch TV, you might see different headlines. And by the end of this class, I hope that we will be able to interpret the validity of environmental headlines. Some of it is science, and some of it is junk, as we read the news. In our Biology 102 course, we're going to use a case study approach over the course of this semester. First, we will have a discovery stage, in which we will describe an event and the consequences of that event. Then we will do analysis, in which we will identify underlying problems and describe both the science and the social implications. Lastly, we will present sustainable solutions. I really want us to understand how we can actually make things better. I hope that these case studies that we look at over the semester will be a way for us to learn lessons in the context of the real world. All right, well, that's it for our Introduction to Environmental Science lecture. Thank you so much for listening, and email me with any questions.